All right, everyone, welcome back. We're going to pick up 1984 by George Orwell, and we are in part two now. So just keep in mind the chapter number is referred to part two. We are in part two, chapter two, which in my Signet Classic edition begins on page 117. Now we're going to continue with the meeting and the relationship of the girl from the fiction department and Winston. So away we go. Now, this chapter seems so much different from the rest of the book that we've read so far because they're actually going to be outside of the city in a countryside in nature. And what we get is so much romantic imagery, a romanticization of nature, but also romantic in the sense of sensuality or sexuality. One quality of romantic literature would be this idealization and this recognition that nature is powerful and majestic and beautiful. So there's a little bit of that going on here right at the very beginning of the chapter where we get these descriptions, including dappled light, gold, boughs, misty bluebells, kiss one's skin, ring doves. These are all quotes that, bring these light, airy, beautiful associations with them. And this natural imagery it contrasts starkly with the dark and dreary city that we've been accustomed to so far, with telescreens watching you wherever you go. This is nature as beauty, and it emphasizes man's connection with nature as sacred, which is something that not only Winston but the entire party is severely lacking. And I'd be interested to know your perspective on, is man's connection with nature sacred? What value do humans get out of being connected with nature, out of the ability to go outside and see beautiful natural images? Winston and the party had been cut off from these natural, and by natural I mean being in nature, these natural experiences, being isolated within the realm of the party in the city. And do you think that it's detrimental to be cut off from that natural, or maybe you could even think of it as a human experience, taking into account our human evolution? Now, there are no telescreens in the countryside, but there are concealed microphones. So that's something we have to keep in mind, that there may be hidden microphones laying around that are tracking. If they hear noise, then, maybe they'll send a patrol out, or if they specifically hear what you're saying, they could still potentially catch you for thought crime or something like that. Now, my first thought was that, I didn't even think that a countryside was part of this setting, right? The setting is the world in which the story is taking place. And until now, my mind has been contained to this city. And it almost seemed like the city or the reach of Big Brother was everywhere. But now we're learning that there's a place where there are no telescreens, right? And it's interesting that Winston could even travel freely to the countryside. So, I'm thinking, why aren't more people doing this? Why doesn't every single party member, every single prole just say, screw this and go to the countryside? Is it because they're brainwashed? Is it because they don't understand that they can do that? They don't have the means, they don't have the money. I understand that, in this sort of a state which is emulating more so of maybe like a mix between a fascist or a communist dictatorship, maybe you don't have the ability to create your own wealth if all labor is provided by the state, if all capital is controlled by the state. So maybe that's one reason. The other reason Winston does note is that there are these patrols, and they will randomly, come up to you and ask you, hey, where are your papers? And obviously Winston's a party member, so he's wearing the blue overalls. And if the patrols see somebody in the blue overalls somewhere where they maybe shouldn't be, which is probably the countryside, you're going to be suspicious. And, this is a direct correlation to places like the Soviet Union, where they certainly did have these patrols who would do these unwarranted searches and question people and demand that they show their paperwork and prove that they had a right to be where they were. So free travel wasn't condoned, although it was possible. But yes, I'm interested to hear what you all think about why don't more people go to that countryside. Is this an oversight by Orwell in his writing, or what other reasons could explain that? Much of this chapter revolves around this relationship between the girl in the fiction department and Winston, and sensuality and nature and beauty. And those three terms are things that have been completely absent from 1984 thus far. And that's intentional, right? Imagine a human life, imagine a human experience without beauty, without sensuality, whether that's in a romantic sense or just the actual literal sensing, right, with your touch, with your taste, with your ears, of beautiful things, of aesthetic things like art, like music, like good food, right? Remember, Winston is eating this gruel every day, this chocolate that's made from like dirt dust that's not even chocolate. You know, their life is devoid of sensual pleasure. It's devoid of things that up until the 1960s in this story would have been part of human lives. And so there is possibly this yearning to get back to that state. And, you know, there is something called the naturalistic fallacy that we'll talk about when we do our debates. But the idea of the naturalistic fallacy is that just because something is natural doesn't mean it's good, right? Just because something came from the earth doesn't mean that it's good. For example, well, ask Chris McCandless about that if you've ever read Into the Wild, right? There are, some poisonous berries out there, and you probably shouldn't eat them. There's that side of the coin where we could be saying, well, Mr. Medina, don't, just because something's natural doesn't mean it's good. Sure. But on the other hand, if your entire life is devoid of nature, devoid of sensual and aesthetic pleasure, is that a good life? And I'll leave that question to you all. So Winston he meets with the girl, and they're finally able to talk a little bit. Winston, he senses his own inferiority as he sees how the girl is so capable. She's such a capable navigator. This is not her first time subverting the party. And, Winston straight up tells her all his faults because he feels like basically less than her. He feels like maybe he doesn't really deserve her, especially because she is younger than him. He tells him, I've got false teeth, I've got this, I've got that. I've got varicose veins. And she doesn't care, and they kiss. And this is the sort of beginning of the more sexual aspect of the chapter. They're talking a little bit on page 122, and the girl has an interesting comment, which is that the way she's been able to get by and pass in the party all these years is to always yell with the crowd. It's the only way to be safe, right? So there's this idea of the crowd, a crowd mentality, and how this is an animalistic kind of thing here, because look at zebras, for example. Zebras have a ridiculous print on their body, right? But the print is designed so when they stand in a herd, you can't make out any one individual zebra. Predator animals can't, and so they're safer within the herd. It creates this, optical illusion or something that makes it more difficult for animals to detect. I think the same idea applies to human beings, right? There's nothing more. Well, you guys are in high school. Some of you are in college. You all know that there's nothing. Whether or not you're in high school, you're in college, or you're an adult at your job, you know that there's nothing more dangerous sometimes than being outside of the crowd, than being alone, than being isolated, than being seen as different, than saying something different from the crowd. It can be a very isolating thing, and especially in this book in 1984, the girl knows that you have to always yell with the crowd to be safe. And that's why she's such a high-ranking member of the Junior Anti-Sex League and these other organizations. She's maybe 25 to 30 years old, but, Winston is 39, I believe. I could be wrong about that, but he's at least 9 or 10 years older than her. But she could see in Winston's face all those times that she was monitoring him, watching him, that he was anti-party, and that's what attracted her to him. So as we kind of discussed last chapter, the reasoning for her following him was to determine whether or not it was safe to contact him, to see was he a party ideologue or not. One other interesting thing to note was that he notices that he is in the exact landscape from one of his dreams in the previous part, in part one. And so now that dream turns from a dream into a sort of prophecy or prediction. And so, this is a great time for you all to talk about how do your dreams interact with reality? And that can be a question that we'll discuss in more depth. How do dreams interact with reality? I do believe there has to be some interaction there. Now, Winston basically predicts what's going to happen, and that's pretty unheard of. Or maybe you all have had experiences of doing this. At the very least, it's inexplicable, right? We have no idea how the human mind could do such a thing. But remember, he's also had dreams about O'Brien in the past, and about that we're going to meet in the place where there is no darkness. So maybe that should change our evaluation of that dream as well. If one of his dreams has already manifested itself, should we change the way we think about his other dreams, even the dream with his family in the beginning of the book? So yeah, think about that question. How do dreams interact with reality? And we'll talk about that. So there's some other, I believe in this chapter, like I was saying before, with the romantic language, there are some symbols or metaphors that are meant to, add beauty, aesthetic beauty. There's definitely a lot of imagery as well. For example, a thrush, a small bird, a songbird maybe, it begins to sing this song and they listen to it. And we could think about whether or not this is symbolism. Is this a metaphor? Who was the bird singing for? We could think about what bird song is, especially if there's no other birds around. Obviously, there's bird song as communication, as a mating ritual. But there's one idea that's brought up here, which is that if there's no other birds responding or there to hear, this is kind of the idea of artistic expression or art for art's sake. Why does a painter paint? Why does a musician play music? It could be, I want to sell something, or I want to show people what I can do. But it can also be, pent up emotion that needs to be expressed. It's just expressing yourself just to do it. There's no real reason. There's no real end other than the act itself. And this, again, is something that has been taken away from the society. There is no real expression for expression's sake, with the idea of thought crime. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear what you all think about possible metaphor there, or symbolism, or what the bird song is. Why would Orwell go through all the trouble of writing this bird song into this chapter? Okay, so we're almost done with the chapter, but I do want to take a look at a couple quotes near the end. So first, we're going to look at the top of page 125, at least in my Signet Classic edition. So I'm going to read this quote, and my question for you after is going to be, what's the deal with purity and corruption here? Why does Winston hate purity? Why does he love that this girl in his mind is not pure? All right. Almost as swiftly as he had imagined it, she had torn her clothes off. This is, again, referring back to his dream, how he imagined that she would do this. She had torn her clothes off, and when she flung them aside, it was with that same magnificent gesture by which a whole civilization seemed to be annihilated. So first, what does Orwell mean, or Winston mean, by a civilization being annihilated by the girl's clothes being thrown off? And next, onto the question of purity and corruption. His heart leapt. Scores of times she had done it. He wished it had been hundreds, thousands. Anything that hinted at corruption always filled him with a wild hope. Who knew? Perhaps the party was rotten under the surface. Its cult of strenuousness and self-denial simply a sham concealing iniquity. If he could have infected the whole lot of them with leprosy or syphilis, how gladly he would have done so. Anything to rot, to weaken, to undermine. He pulled her down so that they were kneeling face to face. Listen, the more men you've had, the more I love you. Do you understand that? Yes, perfectly. I hate purity. I hate goodness. I don't want any virtue to exist anywhere. I want everyone to be corrupt to the bones. Okay, so I'm going to reread my question really quick. Why does Winston hate purity? Why does he want to undermine, to weaken, to corrupt the party? And any idea you have about purity or corruption there will be interesting to me. You know, purity is already a very interesting concept. It has certain religious connotations, which obviously when a party ideology goes this far, it tends to border on the religious, right, with all of the dogma. And I think I'll just go ahead and leave it at that. I'm going to read one more quote for you guys before we wrap this up. This is on the next page on 126. So Winston asks the girl if she likes, meeting men out in the countryside. She says, I adore it. And that was above all the thing he wanted to hear. Not merely the love of one person, but the animal instinct, the simple, undifferentiated desire. That was the force that would tear the party to pieces. So this kind of echoes the same questions I previously asked about purity. But again, what is it about animal instinct and nature in this chapter that Winston is gravitating toward? And why does he think that animal instinct would be the force that would tear the party to pieces? Let me know what you all think about that. He goes on to note that at the end of the chapter that sex was a political act here. And this echoes what we talked about in the last chapter about the lecture that Winston attends, Ingsoc, in relation to chess, right? In that sense, Orwell was mocking the idea of everything is political, right? He was satirizing the idea of the ideology, bringing politics to the forefront of every interaction between people. But now in this sense, we get a sort of a different take, maybe a more empowering take that things can be political acts. So I'm curious also, how would this idea fit in of sex being a political act, in this case with Winston and the girl? All right, everybody, that's the end of chapter 2. A couple of open-ended questions there for you to answer. So I look forward to reading what you have to say, and I'll see you in part 2, chapter 3.